Hello and welcome. Today we will study about the life and times of Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, as we know, is one of the sharpest and gifted poets of the 20th century. She is intensely autobiographical. Her poems explore her own mental anguish, her troubled marriage with a fellow poet, and also many unresolved conflict through her life. She's not only a poet, but she's also a very skilled novelist and prose and story writer. Her novel, The Bell Jar, is symbolic of teenage angst in American culture. She's an American poet, and the style of poetry that she writes is confessional style. In fact, when we talk about confessional poetry, Sylvia Plath's poetry is one of the main poets that we study in confessional poetry. And the dominant themes that she discusses in her poems are despair, violent emotion, obsession, etc. And also, it's a lot of mortality and death that she talks about. So, if we start talking about her life, she was the daughter of Otto Plath and Aurelia Schober. And Otto Plath was a German immigrant. He had come from Germany when he was very young, but he grew to go into research and he was a scientist. He was studying bumblebees. And Aurelia Schober, later on Plath, was actually his student, and there was an age gap of 21 years between the two of them. When they got married, Aurelia, despite having aspirations of her own, did not continue with her career because she wanted, according to her, she wanted some more peace in her life. And in order to just save her marriage, she had to take care of the children. And she eventually starts helping out Otto in his work, assisting him, working for him, and maintaining, helping out with the children, etc. So she spends a lot of time doing work for Otto, and this is something that Sylvia learns while she's growing up. And she also tries to imbibe this kind of a behavior with her own marriage later on. Sylvia is born in 1932, and this is an academic family, and Sylvia is extremely well versed. She loves going to school. She's very sharp. She's very intelligent through her childhood. But at the age of 8, she loses her father, and she loses her father. The father, Otto Plath, actually had a couple of ailments, and predominantly he was suffering with with diabetes, and the diabetes completely changed. He started off with having a toe ailment, and it began and it escalated into his death. And because of diabetes, he was not able to survive. And his death has had a very important, a very shaping influence on Sylvia's life. And later on, she writes about her father's death and also the relationship that she shares with her father. And many of Sylvia Plath's biographers say that Otto Plath was very encouraging for his students, but also slightly maybe more dominant, and maybe too encouraging for the students and pressurizing to his children. And she felt the strain of this emotional relationship while she was growing up. And so Sylvia, when she was growing up, she's extremely outstanding. She's outgoing, she's intelligent, but losing her father has an impact on her, and we get to know about it later. Plath's family moves to Massachusetts, and Aurelia, now that she's the sole breadwinner of her family and she's taking care of both her children, she has to start earning for herself, and she starts teaching secretarial studies in Boston University. 1942 to 1950, Plath is studying in a public school. She's extremely smart. She's writing her poems and short stories. And 1950 is when she wins a scholarship to Smith College. Smith College is one of the best colleges that she could go to. She's extremely intelligent, as I said before. And at Smith also, she's a super achiever. She's an overachiever. She takes a lot of courses, and she does really well in this college. Some of our biographers also say that Smith College had a tradition of encouraging the children, encouraging the students to both have a private as well as a social life, along with their working and studying careers. So the students, all the girls at Smith College, were encouraged to also have a very active dating life. So they were encouraged to go out on dates on weekends, and Sylvia puts up with everything. And this puts a lot of strain on her. In 1953, she joins the Mademoiselle magazine. Mademoiselle magazine is an extremely upcoming magazine. It's a very prestigious magazine, and she wins a competition to become a guest editor here, and she is chosen amongst very few young students to become guest editors. And she goes to New York to work in this magazine, and she's, as I said, she's extremely up and coming, and she's extremely good. But the time that she spends working on the Mademoiselle magazine has a lot of influence on her. It strains her, and she goes into depression. When she comes back, she is in depression, and this is the first time she attempts her suicide, and she attempts suicide by having sleeping pills and just disappearing in her own house, which is suspected by her mother as something wrong. And she informs the police, and she informs the media, and there is in fact a media frenzy because Plath has just returned from Smith College. She's an extremely intelligent girl. People have a lot of expectations of her, and because she suddenly disappeared, it causes a media frenzy, and they eventually find her in her own house, and they start treating her. But this whole episode of being lost and then being found, and also becoming into the headlines, has a great impact on her. And she talks about a certain peanut crunching crowd, quote unquote, in her poetry. And this could mean that she is a little irritated or a little concerned about how people unknown to her were curious about what she does with her life. And she finds this extremely intrusive. Of course, she is going to be treated now, but the treatment of mental illness in 1953 of mental ailments isn't that great, and she receives a botched treatment. And by botched, I mean that she's given shock therapy without anesthesia, and it seems that the doctor also, the ones who are giving her this treatment, also change, and she does not get the kind of treatment that she would have got. And this is the time when there is not much awareness about mental illness, and people say that there is also a lot of stigma around her. In fact, one of her biographers writes that the neighbor who ferries her to the institution for getting electroshock therapy, later on stated that the entire neighborhood had gotten into bad name because Sylvia was going through electroconvulsive therapy, which basically means that people in that time did not have a very high. There was a lot of stigma associated with mental illness, and people with mental illness were looked down upon. Of course, the time has changed now, and people have different opinions of mental illness now, and people are really sympathetic. But this is 1950s, and the whole treatment given to mental illness patients is also extremely unsympathetic, and it's extremely grueling. People are just given shock therapy without anesthesia, and the patient just has to cope up with it. And of course, Sylvia has to go through it, but this particular treatment just completely shakes her. And eventually, she also writes that if she goes to have electroconvulsive therapy or mental illness therapy again, she will not be able to survive. And she, in fact, says that she would, quote unquote, she is fated to become insane, not because of her own mental illness, but because of the treatment meted to patients with mental illness. And this particular episode has a great influence on her, and she in fact writes about this influence in her later novel, which is called The Bell Jar. But she recovers soon, and within 6 months she is back to Smith College. And we can imagine that if after such a therapy she is back to her college within 6 months, it means that she hasn't recovered completely, and episodes of mental illness keep coming back to her life even after this. In 1955, she wins a Fulbright fellowship, and she reaches England. At England, her biographers are of the opinion that she was not able to settle in very well, and she's not able to make many friends. But even so, she's doing really well in England, and she's started writing poetry, and her poetry she's slowly is going into poetic circles, and it is one of these circles that she meets her future husband, who's called Ted Hughes. And at this point, when she meets Ted Hughes, Sylvia is also going through the ending of a previous relationship. So perhaps Ted Hughes is also a kind of a rebound relationship, but she becomes really serious in no time, and they get married in 1956. And they have these are two fellow poets, and they encourage each other, influence each other's poetry. And Ted Hughes, her husband, is a nature poet. He writes about nature. He writes poetry about about nature and the themes surrounding nature, and he is also pushing Sylvia to some extent to follow his lines. And um, and this is the time the couple is trying to make up a living for themselves, and so they go to Smith College as faculty members, and they teach for a while. They teach poetry for a while, but they soon realize that teaching positions are not for them, and they would rather become full-time poets. And it is in America that she attends or she audits a course by Robert Lowell with Anne Sexton, a fellow female poet, as her contemporary, as her classmate, and both of them encourage each other, and both of them write confessional poetry. And of course, Anne Sexton is also another confessional poet who unfortunately also later on committed suicide. So. It is through this course that Sylvia Plath develops an interest in developing her own style, which becomes a confessional style, and we see more of it in her later poetry. 1959, again, because they are both challenged with time constraints and they are not able to write, have enough time to write, decide to go back to London and become full-time writers. They start writing plays for BBC, and they are doing quite well. And in 1960 is the time when they have their first child, who's called Frida Rebecca. This is the time her first volume of poetry, Colossus and Other Poems, is also published. It receives some good reviews, and she's slowly becoming a more accepted poet. And but by this time, Ted Hughes has become a more published poet, is now a celebrated poet. And in fact, Sylvia Plath, as I said before, she had helped Ted Hughes develop his writing style, develop a discipline for his poetry, and she's the one who is actually sending his poetry across to various competitions so that he becomes a better poet. And this is a decision she later on regrets. In fact, to certain publishers, instead of sending her own poetry, she sends Hughes poetry. And this is to some extent of her 1950s upbringing, and also to some extent her own way of redoing the relationship that she saw between both her parents. And she's kind of imbibed this behavior, but she eventually regrets not giving priority to her own career later on. And these are all readings of her biographers of her life. And 1961 is the time when she miscarries another child, and she also writes poetry about this particular episode. And there are speculations that it may be because this miscarriage may have been because she was physically abused by Ted Hughes. So we can imagine that the relationship by now is hitting the rocks, and they're not doing very well as a married couple. And there are speculations. We don't know necessarily whether there was physical abuse or no, but many people are of the opinion that Sylvia did go through a lot of physical abuse with Ted Hughes. In 1961, since the London house where they are living is too small for them, they move to a rural area. They move to a countryside, which is in Devon, and it is here that she writes her first novel, Bell Jar, which is based upon her experience of working at the Mademoiselle magazine, and also going through her whole episode of mental illness. Since this is about her personal life, she writes it with a pseudonym, and this novel is published with a pseudonym of Victoria Lucas. 1962 is when her son is born. At this time, the couple is not doing very well as a married couple, and they both complain that they are not able to do very well as poets because there is a lot of strain in their relationship. In fact, when Ted writes about his relationship to his brother, he says that it is because of Sylvia that he's not able to write very well. Eventually, he also starts having an affair with somebody called Asia Wivel, who they want to sell their property to, and eventually Ted and Asia start also living together and move and go to visit Spain. And this is the time when Sylvia is having a really bad time. saddled with the responsibility of both her children. And on a side note, we also know that Asiya Weavell also committed suicide later on, and somehow she died a death very similar to Sylvia Plath. So this is the time mental illness is not an issue which is really talked about, and people have very low interest in dealing with issues of mental unrest and mental illness. Anyway, coming back to Sylvia Plath's life, this is the last time in her own life, and the last 7 months of her life are extremely grueling. She is not feeling well mentally or physically. She has to deal with a lot of physical strain because she's saddled with the responsibility of both the children. She doesn't have any domestic support, and so she moves out and moves back to London where she had lived before. And this is also the time she starts having sleeping pills, and she loses her appetite. But this is also the time which is very prolific period for her writing. She writes the poetic collection called Ariel, which is a very well known poetry collection, and this is the collection which has most of her very well known poetries. For instance, Daddy, as well as Lady Lazarus, as well as Tulips. So she's writing a lot in this time, but mentally she's not doing well. She moves out from her previous house to London, and this is the time she's for a short while she's also living in Yeats's house, where Yeats has lived as a child, and she's really happy to get this house initially, but eventually her mental illness returns, and she talks about the madness which is returned, and she's haunted by visions of fear and madness, and she's extremely now worried that if she talks about a mental illness, or she wants this mental illness to be treated, she will be institutionalized, and her earlier experience of being institutionalized is extremely bad. She does not want to be institutionalized at all. And so 1963 is the time when her novel is published under a pseudonym, but she's struggling really hard to find a balance between her writing career and her children. And she's also feels this is really unfair on her, because the father of the same children has had taken out this opportunity to go have a good time, just spend his life as a poet, but she's just saddled with all the responsibility. And she's also writing a novel at this point of time, but we don't know what happens of the novel anymore. She commits suicide on February 11. She consumes sleeping pills and seals the children away, and she gasses herself, and she dies. And post death, since she's technically still married to Hughes, she most of her poetry and all the rights of her poetry are all technically belonging to Ted Hughes. So there is a lot of speculation that Ted Hughes had actually tweaked some of her poetry and did not let most of her work come out to the public light. 1965 is the year when Ariel, most well-known work, is published. Later on, 1966, the work Bell Jar is published under her real name. And 1971 is when her other collections are published, which is called Crossing the Water and Winter Trees. And also later on, her letters which she had sent to Aurelia Plath are published. 1977, she is also given the 1977 she published the prose works, and her prose collection is published. And eventually in 1982, she is the first poet to get a Pulitzer Prize post death. So this has been the very short account of Sylvia Plath's life and her times. We will also cover some of Sylvia Plath's important poets in our later videos. Thank you.